5 Aprils, Chapter 4. Twice during the month of February in 1862, the bells rang in every city and town throughout the North, and the name Ulysses S. Grant first became familiar to Jethro. The first real victory for the North had come with the fall of Fort Henry down in Tennessee, just a few miles south of the Kentucky line. "God bless Grant!" people shouted over and over in a rising chant the day Jethro went to Newton with his father after the news of Fort Henry. Guns were fired and people hugged one another in the streets. Here was something to make them proud, something to give them hope after the despairing stories of Bull Run and Ball's Bluff and Wilson's Creek. 2 weeks later came the news that Fort Donelson had also fallen to General Grant. Then people really went wild with joy. "God bless old U.S. Grant," they shrieked. "Bless old unconditional surrender Grant." They laughed and cried. Nearly everybody thought that the war would be over in a matter of weeks. "What do you think, Pa?" Jenny asked eagerly a few days later, as she put down the paper she had been reading aloud to the family. "You think it's about over?" Matt's face was grim. "With the Army of the Potomac doing nothing?" he asked. "Maybe my wits ain't good. Maybe I ain't got the sense to grasp what it is they're doing, but I can see in the end in sight. That general the papers had us believe was so fine, brilliant, they called him. What does he plan? What's the matter with him?" "General McClellan has had typhoid fever, Pa. You know how weak that left Shad. We mustn't judge him too harsh." Matt nodded. "Maybe I misjudged the men, Jenny. God knows I hope that one of these days you can say that your Pa was wrong about General McClellan." He reached out for the week-old paper and read again the letter that was the great tonic and stimulant of the day. "Headquarters Army in the field. Camp near Fort Donelson, February 16th. Gen. S.B. Buckner, Confederate Army. Sir, yours of this date proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except the unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. I am, sir, very respectfully, your OBT servant, U.S. Grant, Brig General." Matt read on further down the page. "It says here that the General Buckner and Grant was comrades at West Point," he remarked, without lifting his eyes from the paper. "Yes," Jethro heard his mother say softly to herself. "And my Bill and Tom was even closer than that." They were worried about Tom and Ed. It was likely that the two boys were with Grant's army. The fighting, especially at Donelson, had been bitter. Some of the details of the battle neither Matt nor Jenny had read aloud to Ellen. Finally, one day Ed Turner brought them a letter from Tom. Ed looked pinched with cold after his long drive, but he wouldn't stop for coffee. "The family needs to be alone when one of these letters comes," he said in answer to Ellen's invitation. "I'd be pleased if you'd let me know what the boy has to say later on when Matt has the time to drop over." Jenny had gone with her father to see about some stock, and Jethro was alone in the cabin with his mother. When Ed Turner was gone, she handed the letter to Jethro. "My hands is shaking, son," she said. They were, indeed, but both she and the boy knew that the real reason she was forced to hand the letter over was the fact that she could not read. The envelope was crumpled and stained, and letter written in pencil in a round, childish hand. It was probably among the first 3 or 4 letters that young Tom had ever written. "Dear folks, I take a pencil in hand to let you know that Eb and me is all right. I expect you to know by now how we took Fort Henry down here. Maybe I oughtn't say we took it, because it was the ironclads that done it. Old Admiral Foote had what it took, and he gave the Rebs dressing down, but some of his ironclads got hit hard. A boy I know was on the Essex, and he was burned so bad he died when that boat got knocked out of the fire and out of the fight. Us boys didn't do much fitting at Fort Henry, But at Donaldson, I can tell you we made up for it. We had done a foolish thing on our way to Donaldson, and I will write you about it. When we was marching toward the fort, the weather was like a hot April day back at home. We was feeling set up about Fort Henry, and when some of the boys got tired of carrying heavy blanket rolls, they just up and throwed them away. Then more and more of us acted like crazy fools, and we throwed our heavy coats away, and things to make our loads a little lighter. As soon as we got to Donaldson, the weather turned cold as Billy Sideways, and some of the boys that was sick and bad hurt, they froze to death in the snow. Things was awful bad with so many killed and other froze. I felt sick when I looked at them, and so I am not so proud about Donaldson as maybe I ought to be. Now miss your good cooking, Ma. You tell Jeff that being a soldier ain't so much. Yours truly, Tom. Jethro noticed that his mother's face was strangely twisted when he looked up from the letter. There was a look about her as if sorrow had been frozen in her face, a look he had not seen there before, not even on the day when he had come home from Walnut Hill to tell her that Bill had left. He stared at Jethro for a time without saying a word. Then she got up and went into the pantry, closing the door behind her. Jethro sat quietly beside the fireplace. There was no sound in the cabin except the crackling of the fire, and there was no feeling inside him except a great loneliness. He picked up Tom's letter and read it again. Then he smoothed it carefully and returned it to the envelope. It seemed strange that this scrap of paper had actually come from a battlefield, that Tom's big hand had actually touched it. He tried to imagine what the ironclads looked like and how they had taken Fort Henry, how the guns must have roared in Donaldson. Whatever in the world had possessed Tom and the other soldiers when they threw away good winter coats and blankets. The pantry door opened after a while, and his mother came back into the kitchen. Your Ma's no company for you this afternoon, son. That's no matter, Ma. Maybe it will be good for you to go down and visit Shad for a while, she suggested after a pause. You need a mite of change. He turned to her eagerly. Could I, Ma? He asked, half in disbelief that he had understood her. I want him to read Tom's letter, she said, taking up the envelope. Maybe after Pa and Jenny has seen it, you could take it on to Shad. Sure, Ma. I'd be proud to do it for you. Ellen smiled wanly at his eagerness. It's terribly cold, but I reckon you could stay the night with him if he's a mind to ask you. Then you'd have only one way to walk. You're doing me a real big favor, Miss Crichton. I allowed it would be, Jeff. Well, you and Chad have a good visit tonight. Ask him to come here for supper tomorrow. Him and little Jenny ain't got many more evenings to be together. The prospect of a visit with Shadrach changed the color of the world around Jeff, and he rushed to get his chores done early. He stacked a high pile of wood outside the kitchen, where it would be reached quickly during the night. Out in the barn, he threw hay down from the loft and carried buckets of corn from the crib in preparation for the evening feeding of the stock. He was working when Jenny came out to find him shortly after she and her father returned from their work. He noticed that her eyes were heavy with tears. Did you read Tom's letter? He asked. She sat down on a mound of hay, and the tears started again. Jethro stood beside her without speaking. After a while, she looked up at him. Ma says you're going up to Shad's tonight. Ma's having him here for supper tomorrow night, so you and him can talk some, he said, recognizing the envy in her look. Ma understands. She'd let me marry Shad before he leaves, but Pa won't. He talked to me about it this afternoon. It was the same old story. We're too young to be married. Jenny, you're just a little girl. Oh, Jeff, it's horrible to be so young. Why does there have to be a war to take Shad away from me before I'm of age? Pa thinks is old enough for marrying. Jethro was sympathetic and terribly uncomfortable. He shifted from one foot to the other and touched her shoulder timidly. She put her hand over his for an instant and then got to her feet. I reckon I got precious little right to be crying over my troubles. He knew she was thinking of Tom, away somewhere in Kentucky or Tennessee with Grant's army. They didn't speak again until they were nearly up to the kitchen door. "I'll help you get bundled up for your trip tonight," she said. Then, and added hurriedly, "Remember to tell me everything he says, Jeff. Will you do that for me?" "I sure will," he answered soberly. There was a time when he would have tested her, but not that evening. There was no time for light-hearted teasing about Shadrach Yale, now that the winter term of school was over. Inside the house, she helped him pull on 2 pairs of Tom's old shoes he was wearing, and she buttoned a heavy sheepskin coat around him, tying up the collar around his ears with her own red woolen scarf. Ellen drew a flat loaf of white bread from the ashes of the fireplace and wrapped it in a clean cloth. "This will keep your hands warm for a part of the way, at least. I ain't much of a gift to carry, but maybe the 2 of you will relish a little change from cornbread." He was patient. He knew that after a while they would let him go. There might be another adjustment of his collar, another gift for Shad, more admonitions about his company manners. But finally they would let him go. And they did. Finally. He had to have his coat unbuttoned at the last minute and Tom's letter pinned securely inside his shirt. But after that there seemed to be no other reason for detaining him. Nothing to do but stand at the window, watching as he plunged out into the cold late afternoon for his visit. The deep ruts in the road were frozen and glazed with ice. The wind had a clean sweep across the prairies, a sweep that sometimes seemed about to carry Jethro before it. Tears froze on his cheeks, and the cold pounded against his forehead as he trudged along, weighted by the heavy, oversized shoes and the many layers of clothing. It was bitter, but not beyond the ordinary. Suffering at the mercy of the elements was accepted by Jethro as being quite as natural as the hunger for green vegetables and fresh fruit that was always with him during the winter. When one found comfort, he was grateful, but he was never such a fool as to expect a great deal of it. The hardships one endured had a purpose. His mother had been careful to make him aware of that. The schoolhouse with the teacher's log room adjoining it stood almost a mile from the Crichton cabin. It had been customary in the years past for the schoolmaster to room and board with first one family and then another throughout the district. The young Yale had protested against the lack of privacy, and Matthew Crichton had been sympathetic. "A man has the right to the dignity of his own fireside after a day's work," he said, and he had allowed his sons and Shadrach to cut down trees from his own land for the annex. Shadrach Yale put down an armful of wood when he saw his guest approaching and came out to the road to meet him. "You look half frozen, Jeff," he said, and taking the boy's hand, ran with him up to the long annex. "Come on inside. I'll have you thawed out in a minute or 2. Shadrach's long, narrow room was cheerful and attractive in spite of its roughness. A bright red and gold paisley cloth covered his homemade table and fell in full folds almost to the floor. There were a few braided rugs of warmly colored woolens scattered about, and on the mantel of the fireplace were candlesticks of heavy brass worn to a smooth satin finish. Opposite the fireplace were shelves made of logs split in half and nailed against the wall to hold books which Shadrach and had brought with him from college. A guitar hung on the wall at the south end of the room, and at the end, too, There was a wide bed made up of several comforters which Ellen had loaned him from her own store of bedding. A cupboard of heavy walnut put together with wooden pegs stood near the fireplace and held dishes, food, and cooking utensils. To Jethro, the room seemed perfect, as beautiful as any man had a right to expect. Shadrach helped him out of his sheepskin coat and put him in the armchair in front of the fireplace, where the flames struck at a great log and shot up into the hot tongues now and then. As the fat from a roasting chicken dripped into the fire, the warmth, the smell of food, and wood smoke overpowered Jethro for a while, and he would have sat silent, drinking in content, if his obligations as a guest had not demanded more of him. "Going to spend the night with me, Jeff?" Shadrach asked, removing the boy's heavy shoes and chafing his feet with cheerful vigor. "Ma allowed I could if you was of a mind to ask me. I think she knew pretty well that I'd be of a mind to ask you. She sent that loaf of white bread for our supper. It's fresh out of the ashes." "Good. I'm glad now that I had the sense to start a chicken roasting. Fresh bread and chicken should make a pretty good meal for a couple of hungry bachelors like us, eh?" Jethro flushed with pleasure. Shad was like that. He was different. He had book learning and was almost 21. Still, he could make a 10-year-old schoolboy feel proud as a man. "How's Jenny?" Shadrach asked him after a while. "She was crying a little. Pa's been talking to her about being too young for marrying me. I know." It was the schoolmaster's turn to flush, and he looked stern, as he did sometimes in the classroom. "Ma would let her get married to you, Shad, but sometimes Pa can be so good, and then agin', he can be awful strict." Shadrach stared gloomily at Jethro's foot, which he still held in his hands. "I respect him so much," he said after a while, "and I owe him so much, but I think he's overshooting the mark when he sets himself up as knowing exactly what is right or wrong for two other people. I think he's being tyrannical, and he stopped himself from thinking that. He stopped himself abruptly." Jethro felt a twinge of loyalty for his father in the face of Shadrach's obvious anger. "Of course, Jenny is real young, Shad," he said, with the gravity of a small person. Shadrach raised a black eyebrow. "Thou too, Brutus?" he asked, grinning a little sourly. Jethro did not understand the allusion, and Shadrach seemed to be in no mood for explanations. "There wouldn't be any question about it if it weren't for this war," he said after a moment with his own thoughts. "I'd be willing to wait years for Jenny. But when I think of leaving her, maybe for a long time, I guess panic hits me a little." "When do you go, Shad?" "Next week. John and I. He'll go as far as Chicago with me. I'll go back to Philadelphia. Seems like I can't face up to your going. I'm not eager for it either, Jeff. Not by a long way. Got a lot of plans for the next 40 or 50 years of my life, but being a soldier is not part of any single one of them." "Do you have to do it then?" "I guess I do. There's been a long chain of events leading up to this time. The dreams of men in my generation are as insignificant as that." He snapped his fingers sharply. "We were foolish enough to reach manhood just when the long fizzing turned into an explosion. Maybe it'll be over soon. I don't know. I know Pa don't think so, but people in Newton was saying that it would, and Jenny even read it in the paper." "What is that saying of your mother's about hope making a fool out of reason? We finally, mind you, have a victory at Fort Henry and Donelson. Then, hooray! The end of the war is in sight for the optimist." "I'm afraid not, Jeff." The mention of the Forts Henry and Donelson made Jethro remember the letter. He hastily unpinned it from the side of his shirt and gave it to Shadrach. I forgot this. It's from Tom. Ma wanted you to read it.